Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. And today I wanted to talk about my reading experience with Elizabeth Gaskell. So I've made a couple of videos like this before. I think I did 10 years of Charles Dickens and 11 years of Jane Austen, where I talked about my reading experience with a particular author over a really long period of time. So I thought today I would talk about Elizabeth Gaskell, who is my other favourite author, alongside Charles Dickens and Jane Austen. Charles Dickens is definitely number one, and then Elizabeth Gaskell and Jane Austen are like joint second place. Sometimes I say that Jane Austen is my second favourite author, and sometimes I say it's Elizabeth Gaskell. I love both of them a lot. I think they're hugely talented authors, and Elizabeth Gaskell is just amazing. So this is my video of 13 and a half years of Elizabeth Gaskell, because I realise it's been 13 and a half years since I first read an Elizabeth Gaskell novel. So the first novel that I ever read by Elizabeth Gaskell was North and South, which remains my favourite book by her, and I think it is probably safe to say that this is my second favourite book of all time after Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. I love it. It is my favourite love story. It is a wonderful book about industrialisation. It's a wonderful coming of age story. It's a book about grief and death and family and hope and, you know, social equality and social justice. It's so good and I love it so much. I first read North and South in March 2007 when I was 13 years old. This was one of the first classics that I read. I think if you've heard me talk about having read Jane Eyre for the first time as a teenager and how it got me into Victorian literature, I think I read Jane Eyre and then I read North and South. And then I read Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I think those were like three of the first Victorian books I ever read. And you know, I loved it. I've loved it ever since. The first experience I had of Elizabeth Gaskell was in fact not reading this book, but watching the miniseries of this book, which is still a fantastic miniseries and I do highly recommend it. I might have also seen the miniseries of Wives and Daughters, which I'll talk about later, before I read North and South, but I'm not certain. I definitely had seen the miniseries of Wives and Daughters before I read Wives and Daughters. So yeah, I first read North and South in March 2007 and fell in love with Elizabeth Gaskell's writing style. I managed to find, bizarrely, on my email account, an email I sent to a friend talking about North and South when I was reading it when I was 13. Me and this friend were emailing back and forth about what we were reading. She was reading Inkheart by Cornelia Funk, and I asked her if she was going to read Inkspell next, and she said, yes, what are you reading at the moment? And I said, and I quote, North and South, it's very old. That was my only comment on North and South, just that it was very old. North and South is a book about a young woman called Margaret Hale who has grown up in the south of England and then through various circumstances ends up going to live in the north of England in a manufacturing town. It looks at her life there and how she gets caught up in all the disputes and complications between masters and workers. It is fantastic. I love it so much. I've read this 4 or 5 times and just every time I read it, it's just so good. The next thing I read by Elizabeth Gaskell is Cranford. Cranford is a novel set in a small country town where all the middle class people are women, chiefly older women. So all the polite society of the town is women in their 40s, 50s and 60s, and the book follows women of that age and their lives and how they all get on with each other from the perspective of a young woman who is staying with some friends there. It's episodical and hilarious and moving and amazing, and I loved it. At the same time that I read Cranford, I also read Elizabeth Gaskell's novella Cousin Phyllis, which is a coming of age story about a young man and his relationship with his cousin and the relationship between his cousin and his friend. The version of Cranford I first read as a teenager was my mum's edition from, I guess, the 70s or the 80s, which had Cousin Phyllis and Cranford bound up in one. So I read those together in the summer of 2007. And then the next 2 things I read by Elizabeth Gaskell were 2 of her novellas, Mr. Harrison's Confessions and My Lady Ludlow, which I read in November 2007. The reason why I'm able to work out these dates is because I know that the TV miniseries of Cranford aired in November 2007. And I know I had definitely read Cranford and therefore also Cousin Phyllis by then. And I know that I watched the first episode of Cranford and I was really confused because there were all these characters who weren't in Cranford. And I was really bewildered by where all these characters had come from. And then I found out that the TV miniseries of Cranford was actually not just adapting Cranford, but also Elizabeth Gaskell's 2 novellas, Mr. Harrison's Confessions and My Lady Ludlow. So I went and read them on Project Gutenberg on my parents' computer before the next episode because I wanted to make sure I knew the stories and knew the characters. So that's how I initially read My Lady Ludlow and Mr. Harrison's Confessions. Mr. Harrison's Confessions is a story set in a small town, and it's about a doctor who comes into this town as a young man who has, you know, scientific ambition, wants to make things better, but also he's one of the few like single respectable men in the neighbourhood, and all of the women are after him, and he's very oblivious and does not realise. It's wonderful, it's hilarious, highly recommend it. My Lady Ludlow is a story about a young woman who goes to live with the magnificent and kind of overbearing, just amazing character, Lady Ludlow, who is this sort of very old-fashioned, stately figure who is quite scary in some ways, but you also get to see a softer side of her, and it's about Lady Ludlow but kind of told from one step removed, and that is a really interesting story as well that I definitely recommend. The next thing I read by Elizabeth Gaskell was Wives and Daughters. So I think I read this in 2008. That's what Goodreads says. I definitely wasn't on Goodreads in 2008, so I obviously put that on Goodreads at some point later, but before now, when I might have remembered better. So it's possible that I read Wives and Daughters very soon after North and South, but I think I probably read it the following year, so let's say I read it in 2008. That's probably vaguely right. Wives and Daughters is the story of a young woman called Molly Gibson who has grown up with her father. Her mother died a long time ago, and then when she's kind of in her late teens, her father decides that she needs a mother figure and remarries. So suddenly Molly goes from it just being her and her father to having a stepmother and a stepsister, and everything changes. It's a wonderful coming of age story. It's a great love story. There are so many things about it that I love. I think it is a truly amazing novel with some of the best characters in all of literature. After I'd read Wives and Daughters in 2008, I didn't read anything by Elizabeth Gaskell for 7 years. That's not strictly true because I did reread North and South twice in that time. So I studied North and South both at school and at university by choice. So at school for my A-levels when I was like 17, 18, I could effectively pick whatever books I wanted to write about for my coursework. So I did one essay comparing Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, and talking about how they explored marriage. And then you had to write about a book from a sort of literary theory perspective. So I think I wrote like a Marxist interpretation of North and South. Then I also studied North and South at university in a Victorian literature module, but I didn't read anything new by Elizabeth Gaskell for years. And I knew I loved Elizabeth Gaskell, so why didn't I read anything more by her? I don't know. But then in October 2015, I read Mary Barton, and I absolutely fell in love with it and fell back in love with Elizabeth Gaskell. Side note here, I always think of October 2015 as like pre-Victober, because I wasn't doing Victober that year. Victober started in October 2016, but in October 2015 I read a lot of Victorian literature, because from October 2014 to the end of September 2015 I was on a Victorian literature ban. I didn't allow myself to read any Victorian literature because I was trying to read lots of contemporary fiction to like get experience and like get more familiar with the market, because I wanted to work in publishing. And then that came to an end, and in October 2015 I was like, I just want to read a lot of Victorian literature, and I read a lot of Victorian literature. I think my like wrap up for that month was called like a very Victorian wrap up. So like pre-Victober, isn't that fun? Anyway, completely beside the point. In October 2015, I read Mary Barton, and it reminded me how much I love Elizabeth Gaskell and like how much more I wanted to discover the rest of her works. Mary Barton is another industrial novel. It is set in Manchester, and it follows a young working woman called Mary Barton who is kind of torn between two different suitors, one of whom is a factory owner's son from the class above her, and one of whom is someone from her own class. And then something happens in this book in the middle which changes everything. If you have this edition, or to be honest, any edition of Mary Barton, do not read the back of the book. It will spoil you for a big thing that happens, and it's really cool and exciting. And yeah, I love how Elizabeth Gaskell can just put you on like a nice simple path and you know where you're going, and then one scene happens and you're like, oh, this was not the book I thought it was. It's so great. Love Mary Barton very, very much. And then I don't know what happened in 2016, but in 2017, that was like my year of Gaskell. I read a hell of a lot of Gaskell in 2017. So first off, I read two of her full-length novels that I hadn't yet read, Ruth and Sylvia's Lovers. Ruth tells the story of a young woman who ends up alone and pregnant outside of marriage, and what happens to her and her story. I've definitely described Ruth on this channel before as Tess of the D'Urbervilles written by someone who had a belief in human goodness, because I feel like Ruth has a lot of similarities to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but is a much more hopeful book and is a really wonderful narrative as well. And then Sylvia's Lovers tells the story of a girl called Sylvia who is torn between two different men, one of whom she feels very passionately for and one of whom she has like an affection for, a fondness for, but not that same kind of passion. She feels very conflicted between them. She's leaning towards one, and then something happens which changes everything in that great way that Elizabeth Gaskell can do. It is a wonderful novel as well. I then read a bunch of her novellas. I read The Moorland Cottage, which tells the story of a girl called Maggie and her complicated relationship with her brother. I read A Dark Night's Work, which is a truly wonderful book. A Dark Night's Work tells a story of a young woman. She lives with her father. There's a blooming romance. Everything seems like a fairly conventional story, and then there's like a big change in the middle of the story where everything changes, a bit like Mary Barton structure-wise, and it's amazing. I really, really love A Dark Night's Work. I think it's just incredible. Then still in the summer of 2017, I also read Lois the Witch. This is a historical fiction work by Elizabeth Gaskell set in America during the Salem witch trials about a girl who gets accused of witchcraft. I also read The Grey Woman and The Poor Clare, which are two like gothic novellas by Elizabeth Gaskell, and then I read a bunch of her short stories as well. Basically in the summer of 2017 I read all the Gaskell I could. I also reread North and South. That was the last time I reread North and South, and it was amazing, and I absolutely just loved it all over again. And I also reread Wives and Daughters, and that for me was a really staggering experience because I just had forgotten how much I loved Wives and Daughters. I actually reread Wives and Daughters 2 years in a row, which when I think about it is quite unusual for me with like any book except for Pride and Prejudice. So I listened to the audiobook of Wives and Daughters in September 2017, and then in October 2018 I decided to also listen to the same audiobook of Wives and Daughters, and I loved it. And Wives and Daughters was a book that I think I had loved as a teenager, and I'd just forgotten how much I loved it, and then rereading it, and twice in the space of like 13 months was just an amazing experience. So I made a video which was like my favourite Victorian novels back in 2016, and Wives and Daughters was at number 20. I have, or I'm about to, make a video this Victober that is an updated version of my favourite novels of all time, and Wives and Daughters is so much higher up that list. It's way near the top now, and I just think it's incredible. Squire Hamley in Wives and Daughters I think might be the best character ever written in terms of his like complexity and everything. Like I think he just might be the most realistic character I've ever encountered in fiction. I do not say that lightly. Another thing by Elizabeth Gaskell that I read in 2017 is her Life of Charlotte Bronte, which is a biography she wrote of Charlotte Bronte, who was her friend. They knew each other, and after Charlotte Bronte's death, she wrote this biography of her. It's a really interesting work. It's a weird thing to read actually, because it's very interesting how different a Victorian idea of a biography is to a contemporary idea of a biography, and I feel like The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell is halfway between a biography and a collection of edited letters with commentary. Like a lot of that book is letters with like Gaskell explaining stuff either side, and it's really interesting to learn both a bit more about Charlotte Bronte's life but also about Gaskell's interaction with her and her friendship with her, and also like about how Elizabeth Gaskell wanted Charlotte Bronte to be remembered. It's really, really interesting, and yeah, definitely worth a read. I also reread Cranford and Mary Barton in 2017 as well, which I haven't mentioned, and again, really enjoyed both of them on a reread. Basically 2017 was the year of Elizabeth Gaskell. It's partly because I did a little mini video series in September and October 2017, which was one of my like author weeks, 2 weeks of Elizabeth Gaskell, where I talked about all of the works I have just spoken about in much more detail. So I'll link that down below because a lot of that still stands. To be honest, all the books were fresher in my memory then because I just read or reread them. But I think I kind of went on like a partially accidental Gaskell binge in 2017, and then after I'd read quite a lot of Gaskell, I wanted to make that video series, so I read even more Gaskell. It kind of makes me sad to think that the last piece of Elizabeth Gaskell I read was when I reread Wives and Daughters in 2018. So I haven't actually read any Gaskell in 2 years. Which is making me sad now, and now I really wish I was rereading some Elizabeth Gaskell for Victober. I don't know. I now have North and South on audiobook. I've never listened to it on audiobook before, and I'm really excited to listen to it. So that's definitely something I will be reading in the coming few months, I think. I think that's going to be a really, really good and enjoyable read. One of my absolute favourite things is listening to favourite books on audiobook. There are a lot of reasons why I love Elizabeth Gaskell. I think, like Dickens, like Jane Austen, like the Bronte, she has that kind of nostalgia feel for me because I loved her books so much when I was a teenager. And even though actually I had only read a handful of her books when I was a teenager, I loved them so much, especially North and South and Wives and Daughters, that like whenever I read a Gaskell book, I can think of that like old 80s edition of North and South that I read when I first read it. There's something really lovely about knowing an author's work well and being able to dip back into it and knowing their writing style and feeling that it is really familiar. Another thing I love about Elizabeth Gaskell is her huge variety. Like when I look at all the different books she wrote, they're all so different. Like, though I love her writing style and though her writing style is consistent, I also feel like if you read all her books without knowing that they were all by the same person, you wouldn't necessarily think they were all by the same person. You know, there's Mary Barton and North and South, which are these kind of intensely urban industrial novels. There's Wives and Daughters, which is like a small town coming of age story. There's Cranford, which is like a small town story about super proto-feminist old ladies. There's Lois the Witch, which is, you know, historical fiction set in Salem about witch trials. Some of her novellas are like really, really gothic in a way that her other work just isn't. Ruth feels a bit like a Thomas Hardy novel, but with a little bit more hope in it. Sylvia's Lovers feels really like a Thomas Hardy novel. Like when I look at her body of work, it's so varied and I'm just like in awe of her talent. Elizabeth Gaskell just always has the power to surprise me, both in like the variations and the differences between her books, but also like the plots of her books themselves. Like several of her books have like really mega twists in them in a wonderful way. There are so many amazing twists in Gaskell, which I just love. Like she has so many rich, compelling, clever plots, which I just think is wonderful. I also love her characterization. Like I said, Squire Hamley in Wives and Daughters, I think might be the most fully realized character I've ever read in a book. He's just amazingly done, and I feel like Gaskell is wonderful at creating and exploring characters, and she's really good in fact at creating characters who are very, very complex and layered. And you know, there are characters who do things wrong and that say wrong things or that are really judgmental or that mess up, but you still completely understand them and they feel so human. Like that's the thing about Gaskell. I feel like she gets realism to a T because her characters are just so fully realised and so psychologically complex and so like just entirely real. I also love the themes in her books. I think her books really wonderfully look at social issues. Like the social critique in Elizabeth Gaskell is wonderful. The way she explores class and the position of women within the Victorian period is just absolutely fantastic. Like I love the way she writes about social issues basically. She's one of those authors that just writes fantastic Condition of England novels, and so many of her books which are so different are Condition of England novels, which I love as well. Like yes, North and South and Mary Barton, which are so strongly about class and right at their heart, but also Cranford is so much about the position of women within Victorian society, and like Ruth is so much about how women are judged and how much reputation matters in the Victorian period and why it shouldn't. Like, oh, I love her books so much. I really love her books. I think that's mostly what I wanted to say today, is that I really love Elizabeth Gaskell and that I've now loved Elizabeth Gaskell for 13.5 years. And I'm pleased about that because she is amazing. And if you haven't read anything by Elizabeth Gaskell, you must. You really, really must. She is so wonderful, so fantastic. I highly recommend starting with North and South, though Wives and Daughters is also a wonderful place to start. I will warn you that Wives and Daughters is like missing its last maybe 20 pages. Elizabeth Gaskell died just before writing the very, very end. Like it's not too unsatisfying because you know what's going to happen, but it is a little bit galling to just miss those final few pages. I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with Cranford because it is quite episodic. I wouldn't recommend starting with Lady Ludlow because it has a weird tangent in the middle, but like elsewhere, go for it. Try Elizabeth Gaskell. She is just absolutely amazing. And that is it for now. Please let me know down in the comments what you think of Elizabeth Gaskell. What authors have you been reading over a really long period of time? Who are the authors who you have been on a long journey with for years and years and years? And that is all I wanted to say. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.